The stone face stared at the sky the way it always had, blank, patient, carved from the volcanic gut of a world no one remembered naming. Sergeant Dara Voss had been staring back at it for 11 minutes, and she was beginning to think it had the better strategy. "Command, this is Voss. We've reached Site 7. She clicked off the radio before they could answer. They'd want a status report. She'd give them one when she had something worth reporting. The plateau stretched in every direction, iron red and breathless. The atmosphere here was thin enough to make your ears ring, but thick enough that you didn't need a full suit, just a breather mask, just enough filter to keep the particulate out of your lungs. The company geologists called it a Class II marginal world. Nobody had a better name for it yet. The survey designation was TH-441, which was the kind of name that made people feel like the universe had been organized by someone's particularly uninspired uncle. 6 months ago, TH-441 had appeared on no one's charts. Then the deep array sensors picked up a mass displacement signature unlike anything in the catalog. And suddenly the world had a name and Voss had new orders, and here she was, standing 11 meters from a thing she could not explain. It was a head. Specifically, it was a head roughly 14 meters tall, carved from the same dark basalt as the plateau around it, and it was not alone. She could see 2 others from where she stood, their profiles rising against the amber sky like accusations. A 4th was half visible at the ridge. Her scanner showed 7 total within sensor range, all oriented the same direction, all looking up. "Voss," that was Corporal Ikan behind her, voice careful, "there's a seam." She turned. He was crouched near the base of the nearest head, running gloved fingers along a line in the rock that shouldn't have been there. Not a geological fault, too precise. A joint, an articulation point. "Don't touch it," she said. "I wasn't going to," he said, which meant he had been about to. She came and looked. The seam ran the full circumference of the statue's base, flush enough that you'd miss it from 3 meters away, obvious once you saw it. The head was not simply carved. It was placed. It had been set here from somewhere else, and she felt the thought move through her with the particular unease of something too large to fully hold. It had been assembled here, piece by piece, in the way you might set a chess piece on a board. By what, the geologists had found no evidence of prior habitation. No ruins, no artifacts, no bone, no road, just the heads and the plateau and the thin howling wind. "Document it," she told Ikan. "Document all of it." She walked to the nearest head and tilted her own back, shading her eyes against the diffuse amber glare. The face was impossible to read. The features were not human. The proportions were subtly wrong, the brow ridge too low, the jaw too wide, but they were trying to be. Or something had tried to make them approximate that shape. The nostrils were carved in a way that suggested they'd been made by something that had studied nostrils but never owned a pair. The eyes were shut. All 7 of them, all shut. She activated her ground-penetrating scanner and swept it slow across the base. The readout came back, and she stared at it for a long moment without speaking. The heads went down. Not just bases, not just roots. They went down for 40 meters, maybe more, into chambers and shafts and passages that honeycombed the plateau like the skeleton of something vast and curled. The heads were not monuments. They were, in some sense she didn't have the vocabulary for yet, the exposed knuckles of something that had folded itself into the ground. "Command," she said, and this time she let them answer. The xenobiologist they sent was named Priya Sato. She arrived on the 2nd shuttle with 3 graduate students, 2 duffel bags, and the calm, focused expression of someone who had spent her career waiting for a phone call like this one, and refused to get too excited about it now that it had finally come. "Tell me about the seismic readings," she said, before the shuttle door had fully opened. Voss told her. Sato listened with her eyes on the plateau, on the ranked silent heads, on the sky above them. "The displacement events," she said. "You said they're rhythmic." "Every 41 hours, give or take 6 minutes. Sato turned to look at her. That's extremely precise for geological activity. It's not geological. No, Sato said, it isn't. They had set up a base camp at the edge of the plateau, close enough to watch the heads, far enough that the underground resonance didn't interfere with the equipment's more sensitive instruments. That was how Sato described it, underground resonance. It was the most neutral possible phrasing for the thing that happened every 41 hours, which was that the plateau breathed. Not literally. The surface didn't move, but something below it did, some vast mechanical exhalation, some slow cycling of systems so enormous they registered on the seismographs as a medium-grade tremor from a distance, and up close, as a vibration in your back molars. The first time Voss felt it, she'd grabbed for her sidearm before she understood what she was doing. She didn't do that anymore, but she still always turned toward the heads. On the 6th day after Sato's arrival, the ground-penetrating surveys came back with their full resolution, and Sato called a briefing that lasted 3 hours and ended with everyone staring at the ceiling of the briefing tent in silence. The chambers below the plateau were not natural, not even close. They were engineered spaces, precisely machined, their dimensions consistent across the full 7-kilometer expanse of the survey area. The heads, all 31 of them now confirmed, were nodes, access points. Each one sat atop a shaft that terminated in a chamber 800 meters down, and each chamber connected to a central structure that Sato's team had taken to calling the core, though she kept apologizing for the imprecision of the word. The core was approximately half a kilometer across. It had a heartbeat. Well, not a heartbeat, something that functioned analogously to one, a cycling pressure differential, rhythmic, regular, indicative of something, movement, process, internal machinery of a kind they had no framework for. It's a habitat, said Priya Sato on the 7th day quietly to Voss in the early amber morning when the camp was still waking up. Not a building, not a bunker, a habitat, something lives there. Lives, Voss said. Lived or is living, or is between. She made a small, frustrated gesture with both hands. Our vocabulary isn't built for this. Voss looked at the nearest head, the closed eyes, the imprecise nostrils. The jaw that was trying to be a jaw the way a translation tries to be the original, close, earnest, and slightly wrong. They were watching, she said. The heads, they're all oriented upward. Yes. They were watching for something. Or watching for someone. Sato looked up at the amber sky, at the pale star at its center. Something left, or was removed, and the rest of them have been watching ever since, waiting for it to come back. Voss thought about that for a long time. She thought about the 41-hour cycle, the regular pulse in the core, something that could keep a rhythm for however long this place had been waiting, unmarked and unvisited, for a signal. She thought about the things her grandmother had told her about the Easter Island stones back on Earth, before Earth got so crowded you had to go looking for room. Stone faces watching the sea, waiting for the boats to come back, waiting for whoever went out in them. What happens, she said, if it comes back and we're standing here? Sato was quiet for a moment. Then we find out if the word meeting applies across a gap this large, she said. 41 hours later, at the 23rd minute of the displacement cycle, the sky opened. Not literally. The sky didn't open, but something traversed the upper atmosphere at a velocity that left a visible trace, a streak of compressed air, luminous, burning off in layers as it shed speed in a controlled descent that should by rights have been impossible, because the velocity at which it entered and the velocity at which it arrived were separated by a deceleration curve that presupposed a grasp of physics that humanity had been working toward for 70 years without yet arriving. The thing that came down was not large. That was the first surprise. Voss had been preparing herself for large. She'd been thinking about scale, about the 31 heads and the half-kilometer core and the 40-meter shafts, and she'd built herself a mental model of something vast and geometric and cold. What came down was roughly the size of a cargo container. It moved with the deliberate economy of something that had no energy to waste and was not afraid, and it came down on the plateau 300 meters from the nearest head and settled to the ground without a sound, which was the second surprise. The third surprise was the texture of it, which was not metal and not stone and not anything she had a word for, a dark material that seemed to absorb light, to drink it in and give back only the barest impression of its surface. In places, the surface moved, not mechanically, organically. She kept losing it against the basalt and having to look again. "Okay," said Iken very quietly beside her. "Okay." Sato was already recording. Her hands were perfectly steady. She was the calmest person on the plateau. Voss would think about that later, about what it must be like to spend your life training for a moment and then to meet it and be steady. To not flinch. The thing moved toward the heads. Not toward their heads, toward the nearest of the stone heads. It moved without hurry, covering the 300 meters in something that looked like walking but wasn't quite, a traveling, a flowing, a purposeful crossing of ground, and it stopped before the stone face and was still. Nothing happened for a long time. And then the stone head opened its eyes. They were not carved. Whatever had been beneath those closed stone lids was not stone. It was a luminous gray silver, faintly self-illuminating, and it swiveled both eyes together downward to regard the thing that stood before it. The head had no expression that a human face would have called an expression, but the quality of the attention was unmistakable. Recognition. The thing from the sky made a sound. Not a sound you heard with your ears, it bypassed that entirely and arrived somewhere closer to the chest, in the frequency range where your body registered things before your brain did. The heads, all 31 of them, opened their eyes simultaneously. The light that came off them flooded the plateau silver-warm. Voss realized she'd stopped breathing. "It came back," Iken whispered. From somewhere she didn't fully know, Voss said, "One of them did." What happened over the next 6 hours, she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe accurately and failing, though she'd make peace with the failing eventually. The thing from the sky communicated with the heads. That much was clear. The exchange used modalities she could partially detect: low-frequency pressure waves, electromagnetic fluctuations, something in the infrared, and could not begin to decode. The heads responded, not all of them equally. Several of them oriented differently in the course of the exchange, subtle rotations of stone that should have been impossible and were happening anyway, and the seismographs below registered the movement in the core as a change in rhythm. Not faster, exactly, but more complex, like a drumline being handed more time signatures to hold. Sato had her equipment running on every channel. She didn't try to interpret in the moment. She recorded. That was the right call. Voss kept the perimeter. It was on her third circuit of the outer ring that she found it. A hollow in the basalt, 200 meters from the nearest head, half sheltered by an outcrop of stone. Inside the hollow, something had been laid. She almost walked past it. She almost did not see it because it was laid with care, deliberately inconspicuous, and because her mind was full of the heads and the light and the weight of all that was happening on the plateau, and she was not, in that moment, looking for something small. But she looked. It was a carving, hand-sized, made from the same dark basalt as everything else on TH-441, shaped with a precision that suggested tools she hadn't seen and couldn't imagine. A head, unmistakably the same proportions as the great ones behind her, the same shut eyes, the same wide jaw, but small, portable, the kind of thing you could carry, the kind of thing, maybe, that you could lose. Or be separated from, in a careless moment, in a catastrophe, in the kind of mistake that had consequences measured in decades. She picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. She turned it over and found on the base a texture she was beginning to recognize, a seam. She stood holding it for a moment, thinking. Then she walked back toward the plateau, toward the thing from the sky, toward the 31 open silver eyes, and she held the small carved head out in both hands because that was the only protocol she had, and it was human and old, and it meant what it meant. Here. I found this. I think it belongs to you. The thing from the sky turned. She had not seen it turn before, in all the hours of observation. She'd watched it move across the plateau and stand before the heads and communicate with them, and she'd cataloged the motion without understanding it. But when it turned toward her, she understood for the first time that she was looking at something that had existed in states she had no reference for, had traveled distances that didn't parse in units she knew, had made a mistake terrible enough to keep 31 ancient things watching a sky for however long this had been, centuries, she thought, more, maybe much more, and had come back. Not to the planet, to the others. It crossed to her in 3 seconds. It stopped at a distance that was either 2 meters or consideration, and it looked at the small stone head in her hands. The silver light from the great heads washed over everything. The plateau hummed at a frequency she felt in her sternum. The thing reached out. The appendage it extended was not a hand. She'd been watching it for 6 hours and she was still not sure what it was, anatomically, but she understood what the gesture meant. She placed the small carved head into that reach, and the contact was cool and brief, and so delicate it barely registered through her gloves. The thing held the small head. The great head's light shifted, warmer, or what she was going to call warmer, the way you called things by the nearest human word and hoped the word didn't lie too badly. The thing from the sky turned back toward the heads, and Voss stepped back and gave them the space. Ikand appeared at her elbow. He'd seen. "You touched it," he said. "It touched me," she said. "There's a difference. Command is going to have feelings about that. Command can take a number." They stood side by side and watched the exchange continue, the alien geometry of it, the silver light, the stone faces in a row with their eyes open at last. The 41-hour clock was resetting. She could feel it in the seismograph readings, in the change of rhythm below, the core adapting to something new. Not an ending, something else. "What do you think it was?" Ikand said eventually. "Whatever made it leave one behind, whatever mistake it made." She thought about the small head in the hollow, the deliberate placement, the care of it, setting it down where it might be found. "I think," she said slowly, "it wasn't an accident, or not entirely." She paused. "I think it was afraid. I think it set one down somewhere it thought was safe, and then something happened and it couldn't come back for it. Not for a very long time." Ikand was quiet for a moment. "That's a very human way to read it." "Yeah," she said. She looked at the heads, the open eyes, the light. "But it's not wrong," she said. "Look at them. We've been doing that to each other since we figured out how to cross water. Leave something behind when you go. Make sure some part of you is waiting for when you get back." The thing from the sky made a sound she felt more than heard. And one by one, slowly, in a sequence that read like a sentence, the great stone heads closed their eyes. Not in sleep, not in dismissal. The way you close your eyes when you're holding something you thought you'd lost, when the relief of it is too large for your face to fully show and you have to go inward for a moment, into the private country of it. She kept watching. That seemed important. That seemed like the least she could offer, to be present and to witness, and to not look away from something just because it was too large or too strange or too far outside the catalog of things she'd been prepared for. She'd tell the briefing they'd made first contact. They'd say with what? Was it hostile? What did it want? What did it communicate? What do we know? And she'd say, "I know it came back for someone. I know it had been a long time. I know the others were waiting." She'd say, "I know what it feels like to lose something important by accident and to carry that for years and to come back." They'd say, "That's not data." She'd say, "It's the oldest data there is." The amber sky above the plateau was emptying of light. The heads were still. The thing from the sky had settled at the center of them, within the ring of stone faces, and it had gone quiet in the way that things go quiet when they've arrived somewhere they belong. She sat down on the basalt with her back to an outcrop and her face to the heads and her radio off. And she was tired in the way you're tired when something true has happened. And she let herself be tired, and she watched. The plateau hummed. The stars came out sharp and cold, the way they do on worlds with thin air and no interference, uncountable and present, every one of them a distance that didn't care whether you understood it. She picked out the brightest. She thought, as she always did in moments like this, and she'd had a few in a career spent at the edges of the mapped and the unmapped, about what her grandmother had said. Not about Easter Island. The other thing. The thing she said every time you left. Go far enough and far enough eventually starts bringing things back to you. The thing in the center of the ring was still. Daravas was still. Somewhere below them, 41 hours from now, a pulse would begin again. A new rhythm. A signal broadcasting on a frequency no human receiver was calibrated for, aimed at a sky full of distances. Saying, "It's here, come and find it, we found it for you." Saying, "We were here when it came home." Saying, "There are things on this small world that understand what it means to wait, and what it means to come back, and what it means to hold something carefully so it isn't lost again." The heads watched the sky. Voss watched the heads. The stars did what stars do.